much simpler and quicker equipment overview for this illustration. With this one, I'm starting directly on my Strathmore Bristol pad, 11 by 17 inches, 100-pound smooth surface Bristol. The layout being done with a 2H Staedtler pencil. The bulk of the pencils are actually being done with a 0.7 millimeter mechanical pencil, these Uni 0.7 HB leads. The slightly wider width, being 0.7 instead of the more normal 0.5, actually makes it a little bit softer, so I can go a little bit darker. However, the deeper, much darker areas, I will do with my 6B Faber-Castell pencil. I also have 6B Staedtler ones that I'll flip between. When this is done and scanned, then it goes into my PC, where using the stylus and my Huion Kamvas Pro 16, the 16-inch 2.5K tablet. This is not a touchscreen tablet, and I'm actually using this upside down, and all of the hotkeys on it are disabled. I much prefer to use the hotkeys on a wireless keyboard instead. And as I've mentioned in other videos, none of the equipment here is sponsored. None of it's been provided for me. This is all stuff I have in my own studio that I've picked up over the years. So with this illustration, this is being done pencils to color, was the intent when I first started it. Unlike the previous two illustration discussion videos I've posted here, where I penciled the image and then inked it, and then subsequently scanned it and colored it in Photoshop, this one is being done directly from the pencils. So it's being done a little bit differently. The initial layout here was done with the 2H Staedtler pencil. I didn't film that portion because it doesn't show up on camera. You can see a little bit of the those 2H lines on the paper right now, but yeah, they really don't get picked up on the camera. So it just moves directly to the HB version of the penciling. Also, unlike the original, those two previous illustration discussion videos, I didn't do an initial sketch for this. Most of the time when I'm working on one of these illustrations, I will do a rough sketch, either in one of my sketchbooks or on my Samsung Galaxy Tab 6 Lite. But in this case, I had a pretty solid idea about what I wanted to do. And I was working from a reference from a photo of a model that I had taken. So I just went directly to the initial layout on the actual sheet of paper. And now I'm going over my initial line art, the 2H line art with this HB pencil, starting with an outline of the main figure, and then I'll be outlining some of the background items. So it's this Halloween sorceress holding onto a railing behind her as she's standing on a pile of books with a library background behind her. The only deviation from my original idea is I was actually originally wanting her to be hovering, but I realized pretty quickly as I was breaking it down that I had made the figure a little bit too large in the frame, and you really wouldn't get the sense of her hovering. So instead, I changed it to have her standing on a whole pile of books just scattered all over the floor. But the basic idea for the piece still holds together. So when I'm doing a pencils to color piece, one big difference in the penciling process, as opposed to working with ink, is that much of the lighting will be done with the pencil portion. Right now I'm just doing the outline, but I will be doing a lot of the shading, a lot of the texturing on the image and in the pencils. And then when I go to do the colors are more enhancing the pencils rather than being a separate procedure on its own. Like it with the inks to color, there are larger areas of white in which I would then make a lot of lighting decisions with the colors. But with this, there won't be very much in the way of white areas on the page to then fill in with color and make a lot of decisions with the color. Most of the lighting will be done with the textures created, the shading created in the pencil portion. But I still start with the basic outline of the figure. I want to make sure to put in the entire figure before I get to any of the actual detail work, before I get to any of the actual penciling, the lighting or anything, to make sure that the anatomy is solid, to make sure that I don't, you don't have one arm longer than the other, you don't have one leg longer than the other. You want everything to work well. So it's really important to make sure that you don't put too much detail in before you've at least laid out the entire illustration. At least that's what I find. This ends up working best for me. And again, this is all from my perspective. These are all the things that I talk about in these illustration discussion videos are basically discussing my process. They're not necessarily the best. They're not necessarily the best for you. But it gives you a starting point if you're looking for help on how to make these sort of decisions when you're composing an illustration, when you're working on the various details of it. I'm not presumed to say that mine is the only or the correct way to go about doing any of this. So again, the basic concept for this piece was this Halloween sorceress in a library with these floating books in front of her that she's reading from, leaning against a railing. This railing would be in front of a walkway. So presumably between the railing and the rest of the bookshelves behind her would be about between 5 and 8 feet of space. So I do want to create a little bit of depth back there. This initial layout though that I'm doing, I am doing it from front to back, laying out putting in the outline of the main character and the railing she's leaning against, because those are both essentially on the same plane, with these floating books that she's reading from being no more than 2 or 3 feet in front of her. So functionally, when lighting falls on everything here, it'll all be falling about the same way. She'll be affected by all 3 of these elements: the sorceress, the books, and the railing. The lighting falling on them will basically all be coming from the same direction or directions. Well, this is actually going to be having 2 different light sources. We'll have 2 different colors, falling in a consistent pattern on these 3 elements to indicate that they're all on the same plane. However, when I start working on the background, the lighting will be a little bit different. Mostly the color will be different in the background just to indicate an extra layer of depth. But we're not getting to that portion just yet. I like keeping that in mind when I'm composing the image initially. But here we're still concentrating on the basic outline. So drawing in the outline of the tattered dress that she's wearing. This is a motif I play with a lot. Over the years, I've been playing with this Angel of Shadows or Angel of Tears kind of character, and she tends to be wearing a torn dress with wings formed out of that torn dress as well. That's sort of acting on its own will. And I'm playing with that idea here as well. It just gives a nice sense of motion. Honestly, it's one of the reasons why I like playing, I like giving my characters long hair and long dresses, anything that can convey a sense of motion and a sense of movement, even if the character is standing still, just adds a little bit more of a dynamic quality. Even if the character is standing completely still and nothing is really happening, we still get that sense of movement, and that adds a little bit more drama. It adds a little bit more visual interest to the piece. So presumably, as she is causing these books to flow around, it's also generating this slight wind around here that is moving her hair, and it's moving her dress. And now you can see where I'm starting to outline all of these books. I do like the idea of using books as a standing platform or a seating platform. I've done this in many illustrations. Books, there are certain elements that I like to draw because they can very easily convey a sense of scale, a sense of perspective. Bookshelves in particular, also brickwork. I like playing with illustrations of characters near in an urban environment where they're standing near a brick wall. The bricks can convey a wonderful sense of scale, so you know exactly how large the character is in the environment, their relation to all the other objects, all the other elements in any given illustration. And bookshelves, they all work the same way. Even though the books themselves will be varying in size, you still have an overall sense of how tall the character is in relation to things like that, to these books. So even if I'm not putting in other figures, it still adds a nice little, visual, bit of visual interest. And now I'm starting to lay in the deeper background of the bookshelves themselves. Now, with the background, with the foreground image, with the main character and the gate, the fence that she's the railing that she's leaning against, and those books, I wanted to outline all of those before I went any further with the illustration. But then when I'm working on the background, I'll only outline a little bit and then immediately switch over, like I am here, to start putting in details, to start putting in the lighting, and putting in the shadows and the textures. This is where I deviate from a lot of other illustrators that I know. I like when I get to the detail work, whether it's in pencils or in color, I like doing the backgrounds first. So here, the outline of the main character is done, but there's no detail on her yet. There's no sense of where lighting is coming from. There's no sense of the difference in the texture in her dress versus her hair or anything. I leave that for last because I want to put all the texture and the lighting into the background first. It gives me a better sense of how lighting in the background can also affect the main character. I talked earlier about how the light sources falling on the main character will be different than on the background because there is this depth. There is this approximately 5 or so feet of space between that railing and the shelf behind her. But there can still be reflected light. If we have a strong light source in the background from the left of frame, and I want the primary light source on the figure to be from the right of frame, that light source in the background will still bounce off of it towards her and create a bit more of a lighting effect as well. And I won't know entirely what that's going to look like until I've developed the light source in the background. So it means that I want to create the setting. I want to create the space that she's living in, because that way, if I create that background first, and then I start doing all the detail work on the main character, it feels more like she's actually in that environment. She's being affected by the lighting in that environment, by any other wind effects or anything else behind her. So she's not just a cardboard cutout sitting in front of another cardboard cutout. It won't look like a series of illustrations stacked on top of each other. I want her to look like she's inhabiting this space. So I'm outlining a small section of the background. Remember, all of that background has actually been detailed in 2H. You really can't see it at this point, but But now going over it with this HB pencil, I will also be building up the details, the texture, the lighting, making the texture on the books a little bit different than on the interior of the shells, because the books are presumably wrapped in leather or paper or cloth, whereas the interior of the shells will be wood. So you want the light to affect it a little bit differently. And yeah, just here putting in some more of the detail on the various books. Just starting with this small bookshelf and working out from there, wanting to make the lighting consistent over the entire background, so that it matches roughly what I'm doing with this particular space. Now, here I'm using a 2H lead in a 0.7 millimeter mechanical pencil. The most common mechanical pencil to use uses a 0.5 lead. I kind of like using 0.7 though, because it's, like I said in the intro, it's a little bit wider. It makes the lead a little bit softer, and it's very easy to create shading with it in a way that the 0.5 lead for HB, it's a little too tight. It isn't as easy to create darker shapes. Now, and darker sections. Now, this won't go quite as dark as I want it to. I will be switching over to a 6B Faber-Castell pencil later. There's also a 6B Staedtler pencil I'll be using later. But that's just to further deepen the shadows more. The bulk of the shading that I want to do, the bulk of the shading, the bulk of the texturing that I want to do, can all be done with this mechanical pencil. And I'm using a mechanical pencil instead of a regular wooden pencil. There's no real reason except for not having to worry about sharpening it so much. But I discovered I like these 0.7 leads in particular. They're very convenient. They're very convenient for carrying around, frankly. I keep a package of these in my backpack when I'm going out anywhere with a sketchbook. Makes less of a mess inside the any of the cases I have than if I just have a pile of softer lead pencils sitting in there. Sometimes I will end up using a lead holder, so I can go up to a 2 millimeter lead instead. The only issue with that is then you do have to go back and be sharpening it periodically, which then ends up creating a mess. So really, the mechanical pencils are great because they really don't create much of a mess when you're working with them. Either when you're working with them or when you're just transporting them around. I do know there are some people who work with pencils a lot who refuse to work with mechanical pencils or with lead holders. And that's fine. Everybody has their own particular methods. And I do have a large collection. Most of the time when I'm doing illustrations like this, I actually, I'll be using a series of softer leads. So working with 2B, 3B, and then again up to 6B or even 9B pencils. But for this particular one, I wanted to work on it as though I was doing this in a coffee shop or doing this in another place in public where I wouldn't, I'd be a lot more aware of not wanting to make a mess. I don't want to leave a whole pile of lead dust everywhere, so the next person who sits at this table, their hands turn all gray, or everything's really messy from the lead dust that was sitting there. And also, this is just really convenient. Makes for a nice, for a slightly quicker experience. I'm not futzing around with the sharpener, even though I have a sharpener sitting there. I was wanting to do some touch-ups with the 2H pencil periodically, so that's what that was for. Also, you notice this was clearly shot a few days before Halloween. I'm recording this on the day before Halloween in 2024. I do like my Halloween-style props everywhere. So, continuing on, doing the background bookshelves, putting in more detail on these leather-bound and cloth-bound books. Periodically dropping in things like this box sitting on top of these books. is that little banner hanging over one of the shelves. As much as I like using bookshelves to create a sense of space, a sense of depth, it can get a little dry if you don't vary that background enough. That can be the problem with using things like this or brickwork, as I mentioned, that it can be a little bit too uniform, a little too dry. You're not, you don't necessarily need to make it super complicated in order to pull focus away from the main character, but you still want to make it an interesting environment. So I will mix up the direction that the books are sitting in. You notice that some of them are laying flat, some of them are vertical, and some of them will actually be leaning diagonally against other ones, but I'll also put in other elements, small statuary, little boxes, the banners hanging down, small banners hanging down from one shelf over another. I'll end up further into the illustration having bits of paper that are actually folded over the side of the shelves, and then some bits of artwork that are just jutting out a little bit or flush with the front of the shelves, so that while it's creating a more or less consistent plane, the details in that plane will vary and be a little bit more interesting. They won't be completely uniform and dull. Oh, and here, because I'm dealing with shelves, so they go back a little bit, I also get to put in some additional shading onto the back of the shelf. The books themselves are blocking light, or as I'm detailing here, that banner is actually blocking light from one of the two light sources. So again, adding a little bit more depth into that background. Now moving to the uppermost shelf on the left-hand side, and this vaguely Maltese Falcon inspired bit of statuary, somewhere between that and a crow kind of a feel, again going with that kind of Halloween vibe. This isn't necessarily a horror image, but there will be a certain amount of Halloween imagery in there. It definitely seasonally appropriate kind of an image. And I do like doing a lot of these around October. Honestly, I like doing these any time of the year, but it does seem most appropriate in and around October. As to why I'm doing this as full pencils, then going to color, rather than pencils to inks and then color, I like doing, when I'm doing a softer piece, when I'm doing something that seems it's supposed to be a bit more organic. So we're dealing with magical elements in a library setting. It has a bit more of an organic feel. It's mostly woods in the background. The railing itself will actually be metal, but like a wrought iron kind of a look. So very uneven. All the bookshelves, not only are the books a little bit rough, the shelves themselves have bent and bowed over the years. Clearly this would be a very old space, so everything in it will have distorted over the years. And I like that kind of organic feel. When I work with inks, even though I still don't tend to use rulers a whole lot because I still want to keep a bit of an organic feel to it. For me, working with inks tends to work better for a more urban setting or more of a science fiction or cyberpunk setting. So I'm transforming metal into an organic feel, but it still has to have that metal texture. And while I've done full pencils with a metal cyberpunk style environment, overall, I prefer working with inks for that sort of thing. It just gives me that little bit of extra edge, separating it from something that's more of a fantasy or horror base. I had done a piece a couple of years ago of a figure sitting in the middle of a large pile of computers. It's like she was in a server room or something. And that was done pencils, full pencils. It was actually a pencils to color piece. There is that's actually another video up here on my YouTube channel. And I do like how that turned out. But yeah, overall, when I'm doing any of those pieces of figures in server rooms, figures surrounded by computers and technology that way, I much prefer doing it with inks. I like that there's a slightly higher contrast in between the line art and in the line art itself, actually. Here, there's a uniform gray. I don't like leaving a whole lot of white space when I'm working with full pencils because I want that gray to create a texture itself. And now we're getting right now I'm working on this section of the bookshelf that's actually a door. So there's a handle on that. I've now moved down to the pumpkins, but I had created a door, a handle jutting out of the door. So some books that would be sequestered behind a door. I had a bookshelf like that previously where there was an encyclopedia set on the top 3 shelves. And then below that was this door with a handle jutting out of the front of it. And inside that would be put vases and glassware and things like that, just to keep it a bit more separate. So further into the Halloween nature of this, I have littered that walkway behind her with these jack-o'-lanterns. Going into this, I knew that the color scheme was going to be purple and green. Very stylized Halloween colors. I know orange and black would also have been appropriate. I've done a few pieces in the last couple of years using an orange and green palette, and I find that works well with that kind of borderline cartoony Halloween vibe. It's not completely serious. It can be, but it creates a fun environment. Still seems Halloweeny while being separated from a lot of other work that people do around this time of the year, where they're doing more orange and black. That particular Halloween color scheme. It's complementary to it. It works very well with it, but it keeps it just a little bit distinct. And I tend to like that palette. It's very similar to the synthwave colors and the red-blue colors I do when I'm doing more cyberpunk-based work. I'll lean heavily into red and blue light sources. So the horror work will lean more towards purple and green light sources. Sometimes I'll mix that up. I did a few cyberpunk pieces where the primary lights were red and blue, but then there was a third light source that was in green, just to give it this unsettling feel, this intrusion. There's one where there's a seated character in one of those high-tech environments. She's completely surrounded by computers, and all the lighting around her is in red and blue, but the book itself clearly is slipping over into this more horror-based world. The book itself is glowing green. It is a green light source, so it's casting that green from below onto her as well. So I like mixing that kind of thing up as well. So dealing with these kind of palettes consistently, gives an overall feel to a lot of my standalone work. It all feels like it's part of a series while still being standalone pieces. I had mentioned that I'm incorporating some other pieces of artwork into this, some paintings or illustrations on that background, on that back shelving unit, and this is one of them. Just creating this grinning face as a freestanding painting right behind her. Also sitting, it's a little bit recessed. Probably there would be a shelf there, and so pushed back to where the painting would actually sit. This is a pretty common thing in a lot of older libraries. Normally in those libraries, the artwork would be up a little bit higher, or there would be a bit more space between it and the surrounding bookshelves. I like creating this density, this real sense of a space that the characters are inhabiting. generally when I'm making these sorts of illustrations, I really like not just being about the character, but also being about the place they're inhabiting, about being the space. I like dealing with negative space. I like dealing with the environment because that informs the character. Not only is she this sorcerer, I could have just had her standing with the railing and nothing in the floating books, and that tells you a lot about the character. But by introducing this background library, it's telling you more about her as well. So while I do appreciate standalone images, and I've certainly done quite a few of them, I tend to find ones where I develop the background to be a lot more satisfying. From my perspective, I like knowing what sort of world the person that's being drawn comes from, what sort of world they're inhabiting. So even just a quick attempt at a background will always feel a little bit better for me when looking at other people's artwork. Again, it depends on the intent. For sticker designs, this would not work overly well. I would have to separate that character from the background before I did any sort of sticker design. There's a little bit too much detail in this to want to shrink it down to traditional sticker designs, but I don't tend to do a lot of work like that. I have in the past. I've done a few series of illustrations that were based on that sort of much simpler, much more graphic in the art, printing or advertising art sort of way. But yeah, things like this where I really get to build up this sort of density of background, where I get to create the world of the character. It's just telling the viewer a lot more about the character, about who they are, what sort of a person that they are, the kind of space that they want to be in. So now I'm playing with another pentagram. Works well with the subject matter here. In this case, it's one just kind of haloing her, so sitting behind her head, a little bit off center. I don't like making things too perfectly symmetrical. I want it to be a little bit off. That's just, if it's too perfectly symmetrical, it can feel extremely artificial. And I especially with this, a piece like this where I want it to feel really organic. Excuse me. Hinting at symmetry is good. You know, this circular pattern behind her hair, behind her head, creating the sense of the halo is nice. But yeah, if I made it perfectly centered right behind her, if I made everything really symmetrical, then it would be too much of a character design and not about a person. And that's more what I'm looking for. I tend to want the characters I'm drawing to feel like they're actually people, that they have a story. I'm not necessarily telling you what that story is. I really want the viewer to figure that part out on their own. But I want to drop a lot of hints. At the very least, I want to imply that there is a story. There is something going on. She's not just posing in front of this railing. There's actually a reason why she's in this particular place. Why she's standing here reading these books, causing, it looks like she's starting to cause an effect. Like she's about to do something huge. And so this is sort of a preamble. What it is specifically, I don't know. I have ideas, but I'm really just setting up that sort of dramatic tension for the viewer, so they can figure it on their own what it is that she's doing. I don't like answering all the questions that I pose, and even things when people ask what is this particular illustration about. I don't tend to like to answer those too directly. I'm happy talking about technique and about inspiration, about the overall style of the piece, but the actual meaning, I prefer to let the viewer figure that out on their own, because everybody will have a different version. Everybody will have a different interpretation. And I like that. I want everybody to bring their own experience, even when looking at something as simple as an illustration of a sorceress at Halloween in a library surrounded by floating books, a pentagram relief behind her, these other illustrations back there. What are all these books about? Why is she in this particular space? Why are there these pumpkins here? The pumpkins are here probably because it's Halloween. But is there something more going on? Possibly. Probably. What is it? That's for you to decide. Not for me. I'm presenting all this. I want you to answer the questions as much or as little as you feel you need to. So as I go along with this, you can see how the lighting and the texture remains consistent, more or less, for the background. The texture will vary depending on the type of material, whether it's the wood or leather or cloth. But the lighting is still maintaining an overall consistency for all the elements in the background. And then that will be slightly different on the main figure. But like I said earlier, I can already see where the lighting on the background will affect the main character. My idea roughly at this point is the background will mostly be affected by a green light, which can then spill onto the main character, but just creating a side light on her. So it's bouncing forward and to the left of, and from the left of frame. So it'll create basically a side light or a rim light on the left side of the figure. But on her, there will be this purple light coming from the right of frame. That purple light will affect the background, but it'll be less intense. The background is more the green shades. The foreground will be more about the purple shades. This has the effect of separating those two planes further in space. It'll create that sense of depth. And just add to the reality that it's not just an abstract shape. This isn't going to be an abstract design. There is a sense of realism here. Not photorealism. I very much do not do photorealism with these sorts of illustrations. But I do want there to be this consistent realism to them. Like, okay, this isn't in our world, but it is in a world. It's there is a reality happening here. Oh, and here I get to play with a slightly different texture, this crystal ball. So the glass sphere itself has a certain texture, but it's also reflecting and grabbing the elements around it and projecting those elements through itself. So you get the sense of, well, there is a cloth or leather book to the side that is seen through this glass surface. So you're seeing both the texture of glass and still a little bit of the leather or the cloth. Difficult to see too much of it considering how small it is in the frame, but I still want to create the sense, at least the impression, that there are varying textures within that glass ball, within that crystal ball. It isn't a pitted one with lots of different, lots of imperfections in it. I wanted to keep it fairly simple to just play with those reflection effects. I love playing with reflections. One of the reasons why in other illustrations I deal so much with metal is because I love playing with reflections. So doing glass surfaces, doing metal surfaces. There's not a whole lot of opportunity in this particular illustration for that sort of thing, but I still have that one crystal ball in there. So at least I get a little bit of reflections. And later on, when I'm playing with some glowing effects, I will add that to the crystal ball to give it even more life, separating it further. But already you can see on that shelf how that crystal ball, it does separate well from everything on the shelf, but it doesn't overpower anything. It's not jumping out too far. It has a little bit more open space, but not a lot of it. I don't want to pull too much attention towards that crystal ball as opposed to everything else in the environment. But it's just another small detail to indicate that while it's part of the environment itself does change periodically. So the elements of the hanging flags, the statuary, the pumpkins along the floor, the 2 pumpkins in that one shelf, and that crystal ball are still all a little bit different from all the books on the shelves themselves. So below that railing are a pile of skulls. Here's another fun Halloween gag. This is loosely based on a couple of different things I've seen recently, including one that was a BBC news article from the mid-1960s about a church in Wales where they had discovered there were piles of bones in a basement that had been sealed up for a couple of centuries, and it just had a fascinating look. Seeing these shelves filled with human bones and skulls and such, and it just gave me the idea of this row of skeletons, or this row of skulls underneath this walkway. Also kind of looking like the catacombs of Paris, where they would also be storing a lot of human bones, a lot of human remains. All very sinister looking, and gives it another fun Halloween kind of vibe. So decided that it would do 2 things. One is just creating a little bit more depth, a little bit more visual interest. Like, you know, see this a whole heck of a lot in libraries. In a lot of libraries, sure, you'll see a skull or a couple of skulls, but having an entire platform supported by these skulls seems a little bit weird. But the other thing is, you'll notice the skulls on the left side of frame are looking to the left. The skulls on the right side of the frame are looking to the right. The rough idea is it's meant to imply that this is it's to add to the idea of 3-dimensionality. Realistically, these skulls are probably, well, this is an exaggerated version of it. The intent is the skulls are all facing forward, but because this is 3-dimensional space, the further to the left or right they are from the viewer, the more they'll actually look. It'll look like they're looking away, either to the left or the right, just because that's how perspective works. Now, this is, again, a very exaggerated version of that. In reality, they wouldn't look quite so far off to the left or the right. But it gives it this slightly heightened sense of reality. So I get to have fun with making this row of skulls. They're not uniformly drawn. They're not all drawn the same way. So they don't end up being, too boring. It's not too flat of an image. There could be some visual distinction between them, and the way light falls on them a little bit differently. We'll also change that up depending on where they are in space, if there's anything blocking the light around them. So yeah, creates a fun little extra bit of interest. Now getting into putting all the detail on the books that she's standing on. I have a fairly extensive library, most of which are role-playing game books, but a lot of other horror books, sci-fi books, general interest books, a lot of books on history, things like that, in my own collection. And I do like adding some of those as an extra bit of visual interest for a bunch of reasons. Again, creating a sense of depth, creating a sense of space, but also the books by themselves are fun to draw. Okay, so now all the background elements have been done. And it's creating mostly a sense of the plane behind her. but a little bit of the railing that she's leaning against. There is a uniform white on either side of the railing to help bring it forward in space a little bit. Now, it's still fairly gray. I'll be adding an extra outline on that background railing with a softer pencil using a 6B pencil. The same reason I'll be adding an extra outline around the character. Even though the intent for this piece is to be scanned at high resolution and then painted in Photoshop, so it'd be very easy to separate the planes that way, I also want the pencil illustration itself to be a standalone illustration. All of these pieces that I do when I'm doing a physical piece of artwork and then scanning it and doing the painted portion, the color portion digitally, I want the physical artwork to be complete. It needs to be a standalone image. All of the inked pieces have to stand on their own. All the pencil pieces have to stand on their own. So I want to make sure that by the time this is finished, the planes have separated well enough. You've got a good enough sense of depth. The character jumps out, but doesn't look like she's separate from the environment. She still lives in that environment. One major difference between my approach here and when I'm doing ink work is that when I get to shading the skin of the main character, quite often in inked illustrations, I won't do very much detail. Most of that detail would be done in the coloring stage, because in an ink illustration, leaving the flesh tones of a character open tends to work. It works really well as a graphic image and brings that character out a little bit more. Also, the more line art you add in an ink illustration, the older the character becomes, because those lines end up looking a lot, because of the high contrast in an ink illustration. Those better represent musculature, wrinkles, any sort of additional detail like that. So the less line art you put into skin tone when doing an ink illustration, the younger the character feels, the more the character will stand out from the rest of the background, especially if I do a heavy background like this. However, when I'm doing a pencil illustration, I will still put in a lot of pencil detail. It'll be a different texture than, say, the dress that I'm drawing right now. This dress will have a lot more deep contrast. It'll have a lot more pencil texture, creating a rougher texture than on the skin tones. But I will still put in a lot of pencil work into the skin tones. Because remember, all of the lighting decisions are being made while doing the pencils. I'm really not leaving a whole lot of room for interpretation for the colors. The rough idea is when I go to color this, I could leave the colors as just flat, and the illustration will still have a lot of depth because of all of the lighting choices made in the pencils. Now, I'm not going to be leaving it flat. I will be enhancing things where the pencils get lighter. I will be putting in brighter colors. So I will still be changing up the color values quite a bit in the pencil work, but it won't be as much as when I do an ink piece. Although even with the ink pieces I tend to ink them so densely for the particular style of work that I like to do, that even with those, certainly the background, most of the color and lighting decisions will already have been made before I get to the coloring stage. And this would be more just enhancing that. But that's much more the case when I'm doing a pencils to color piece rather than a pencil to ink to color piece. So here, just like how I was doing this illustration back to front, the stages for me working on a character, I tend to do the hair first, but that's not always the case. But I certainly do the outfit that they're wearing before I get to the skin tones. I usually leave the skin tones for last and then start getting into other smaller details. Oh, and here you can see that I switched over to using the Faber-Castell 6B pencil to put a darker line, a thicker and darker line around the main character, to have it pop out a little bit more. It's much more dramatic in real life than on camera, but even on camera, it's jumping out a little bit more. And I also did that along the outside of the railing. And so now getting into working on the texture and the shading on the main character. Some people would refer to this as the rendering portion. Usually leaving the face for last. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm leaving the most interesting part to draw for last. So I always have something to look forward to. And I know a lot of artists work the other way. They do the opposite. They'll work from front to back and starting with the face and working out from there. And I get it. It does make a lot of sense. I just tend to, again, my philosophy on this is I want to know what the environment is, because that informs the nature of the character, but it also informs the lighting. It also informs how the lights in the environment will fall on the main character, how much of that, the closer it matches to the back, the closer the lighting on the character matches the background, the closer the character is to the background. So I want to have her lit differently than the background, but I still want to have that light bouncing from the background to her. So now I'm building up these soft layers of pencil on the skin tone. I actually do this on pretty much every texture, every area that I deal with textures and shadowing, but it's particularly noticeable when I'm working on skin tones, where I will lay down a light pencil layer indicating the shadow and light pattern, indicating the texture pattern, and then go over it a second time, building it up gradually. I've had people who've watched my penciling technique describe it as actually painting with a pencil. I find for me that's the best way I can control that I don't overdo particular patterns of light and shadow. That I don't make the shadows to start with a little bit too dark, and then you'd have to go in and erase everything. Note, every time you erase something on a piece of paper, you're actually damaging the paper, and it can make it more difficult, or it can distort the texture you're creating later with the pencil, and especially with inks later, because then the ink won't flow properly over the area that's been damaged. So I try to keep that to a minimum. I know that when I used to teach art, it would actually stress out some of my students when they were watching me draw that I would never use my eraser. Instead, I would just gradually build things up over time. So here is the final pencil version. And this is then scanned. It's scanned full size, so 11 by 17, in 11 inches by 17 inches at 1200 DPI. Now, in order to make something print ready, you want to have it at least 300 DPI at whatever size you're working at. I way overshoot that. I scan it at 1200 DPI, but I only paint it at 600 DPI. This is being done in Photoshop. So I create the Photoshop file, assemble my page at originally at 1200 DPI. Then I'll reduce it down to 600 for the actual colored version, for the painting version. Now you'll notice I have a few layers going. The background layer is the color layer furthest away from the viewer. And then when I'm doing pencils to color, I will then stack layers on top of that. So right now, I'm doing background elements. These are the various, as you can see here now where it's all purple, Those are the background book layers, the pumpkins, the statuary, and then above that will be the next selection of elements. In this case, the this crystal ball. The line art itself is actually sitting on a layer above all of this, and I have the layer set to multiply. So the line art itself is black, but because I have it set to multiply, it will actually show all the colors beneath it. But the black layer will then be multiplied on top of that. Like mathematically, it will just become more and more intense. So that when you print it, the line art won't actually go completely black like it would if I was using regular inks. Because the pencils, no matter how dark they never go completely black. They will always show some of the color underneath them. I also want the pencils themselves to take on some of the characteristics of the colors underneath them. It creates a little bit of a softer feel. I tend to really like doing that. If I was doing a really complicated illustration, I wouldn't necessarily be putting all these flat layers down. Instead, I would be putting all, when I create all the various color blocks, it would be on the same layer, but then I would create a mask where I'd be able to select any of those colors on an additional channel later on after painting. But because I'm putting them on separate layers, I can then lock that layer. So I know when I want to paint it, I don't have to worry about selecting just the colors that are in that particular layer. I can instead just leave it, take an airbrush tool, take the gradient tool and spray it over the entire image, and it will only affect the elements on that layer. Also, the colors I'm putting down, they are based on this palette that I've got. You can see in the center of the screen that I've built over time for this whole purple and green color pattern that I want to use. At this stage, though, I haven't decided on the final colors for this, and it actually doesn't really matter. If it's the same as with the previous illustration discussion videos that I've posted, where when I talk about the color pattern, the flats portion of this, it doesn't actually matter what colors I put down. It just needs to be solid blocks of color. Because then when I go to paint that layer, I can very easily change it. Like I said, these layers are actually locked. So using the fill tool, I can change it to any color I want. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and grab colors from the palette to choose, but they will be, you'll notice when I start actually painting, I will be changing that background color on each layer. The biggest reason I do that is I want to be able to change all those background colors when I first start painting them to the darkest color. I paint from the shadows to the light. So I will choose the darkest possible color I can for a particular element, and then I will gradually lighten it. Think of it, if I was painting an illustration of Superman, on the blues on his costume, I would choose the darkest blue I possibly could, put it down, and then grab a mid-tone and start painting into that. So I'm painting with light. And then I would go over it again and put in brighter highlights. But that's really what I'm doing here. So I use the gradient tool to create a bit of a lighter pattern in the deep background. And now, using the paintbrush tool, now I'm starting to pick out the details. This is just going to be the first pass on the deep background. I'm actually going to be putting in some special effects layers between these various color layers, so they'll affect them all simultaneously, to further separate this wall of bookshelves and books and various items there, and give it more of a green feel. Right now, I mentioned earlier that the background color, the primary color in the background will be green. It'll be green coming from the left side of frame. But I want to leave that for now, mostly to have it as a lighting effect over the entire background. So instead, I'm hand painting in mostly the purple light that's coming from the right of frame to give it a little bit of three-dimensional feel. And as you can see, I'm really only painting into the lighter areas of the pencils. I'm letting the texture of the pencils themselves do the heavy lifting on indicating light sources. So this is on its own layer, the various books and bits of statuary and such. And you'll also notice that I can paint anywhere. It will only affect those books. It won't affect anything behind it. It won't affect the railing in front of it. It won't affect the sorceress in the foreground, or there's books floating in the deep foreground. Now I've switched to a second layer using a gradient tool, throwing in a bit more of the purple color, that purple light coming from the left side of frame. I will be going in afterwards and putting in some green light from the side, from the left-hand side of frame. But most of that, once again, will be left to the final special effects layers that'll be going over the whole thing to really establish that there's a green light over the background, a purple light over the main character and foreground elements. Let's see. Also adding this green glow emanating from the center of all of these pumpkins. So they themselves are also light sources. They're not hugely affecting their environment. It's a very soft light. You can see even in the glow of the eyes and the mouth, there is still pencil texture in there, indicating that it's not a very strong light source. If it was a really strong light source, it would just be going to white. Certainly in the pencil stage, it would have just gone to white. I'll be tweaking it a little bit later at one of the special effects stages, where it'll actually tweak. I'll be putting a glowing effect over the line art as well. But this is the first time I'm actually playing with some of the light, the green light coming from the left side of frame into this crystal ball, and then a brighter purple light from the right side of frame, giving it a lot more contrast. So after establishing that background, doing the basic pass on the deep background, I am now working on the railing, dealing primarily with that purple light coming from the right side of frame, going for a higher contrast to indicate that this is actually metal. It's not super shiny metal. Mentioned earlier, this is more like a cast iron or a wrought iron railing, very uneven. Not the most well-built railing in the world, but it'd be stable, but a little on the rough side. So I'm not really going to be going to white when painting this part, but it will be picking up an awful lot of that purple light from the side, from the right-hand side of frame. And I'm always talking about the right-hand side of frame or the left-hand side of frame, instead of just saying the left or the right, because that can get confusing when you're talking about the character. So when you're dealing with the character in the frame, well, it has to be the left-hand side of the frame, because that would be her right side if she's facing towards the viewer. So it's better just to be a bit more clear about that. Carrying that purple light through to the books in the foreground, the books that she's standing on. Yeah, we got more of the purple light. We'll be going a little bit brighter at some point. This is just basically establishing the mid-tone, the mid-color. I put down a fairly dark purple originally, painting in this lighter purple, magenta-ish purple. Now we're starting to establish some of the green light coming from the left of frame that will be falling on these books and then onto the character as well, and the railing. So you can see that the light I intend to blanket the background with is affecting the foreground as well, but not to the same extent. It's more just a touch to establish more of a three-dimensional feel. The background will end up getting a little bit flattened out, which makes sense. It's further away. It's less detailed. It's less relevant. It's not the important part of the image. The focus of this illustration is the main character and the elements that she is interacting with. So the book she's standing on, the books that are floating in front of her. I do want the background to recede a little bit. As much detail as there is back there, this illustration is not about the setting. It's just, I want to make sure to put in a fairly dense, story-heavy setting. But if I make the background too interesting, it can actually pull focus away from the main character. And ultimately, this is always going to be, the story being told here is always about that main character, not the setting. The setting is just a helpful guide. It's a useful tool to aid in creating the story. But the story is still supposed to be about the main character. Any sort of emotional weight in this illustration is about the main character. And adding a little bit of this green light onto the skulls beneath the beneath that walkway. And now we're putting in a bit of these green highlights into the background. Again, to create a little bit of a sense of three-dimensionality, which a lot of this will get pushed back when I use the gradient tool to cast a very large green light over all of this, but it will still be there. There'll still be the sense that even though the background's being pushed further back and it's being flattened a little bit so that the focus is on the main character, it will still have a bit of sense of the three-dimensional quality. You know, the books will still feel like they go further into the shelving unit, into the bookshelves. Other things will feel like they're sticking out a little bit. And as long as we're getting a little bit of that sense, that's fine. They don't need to jump off of the page. It's not, because this story is not about those books. The image is about the main character. So now I'm getting into painting the hair on the main character. All the background stuff is mostly done except for that final green lighting pass. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on the purple light coming from the right of frame. This purple light will get a lot more pure and a lot brighter as I'm painting along, especially here in the hair. The model reference, the photo that I had taken that I was basing all of this on, the model is blonde, and I'm roughly basing the hair on the model's hair. Now, this hair is much longer, and it's flowing in a very different direction than it was in the original photo, but I'm still using it as inspiration. So I want to make sure it gets to be fairly bright, fairly light, especially when I'm dealing with two different colors. I still want to have a sense of the translucency of blonde hair. So now I'm building in the green side light as well into the hair. I tend to work on each of these elements individually at first. So I'll paint up most of the hair, and then I'll switch. You'll see later I'll be switching to the dress, and I'll paint most. I'll do most of the painting I want to do on the dress, and then on the skin tones. And then after that, I'll go back and see, okay, the hair needs to be a little bit brighter here. The skin tone needs to be punched up a little bit more here, but it'll almost always be lighting, increasing the amount of light. Very rarely will I ever go back and make anything darker, because because I started with the darkest possible colors and I'm painting light into that space. I don't tend to have to go back and add additional shadows. The shadows are already in the line art. The shadows are already in the original color that I laid down. This is about casting light onto the figure, casting light onto the background objects. And now you can see that I'm going to more of a highlight color. If I had started with the highlight color, that very bright, very light green, and then tried to paint in the darker green, and then paint it even darker, you can run the risk of the illustration having too much contrast, and suddenly the dark areas are way too dark. It stops looking natural. Again, I'm not looking for any sort of realism here, any sort of hyper realism. It's not supposed to look like the real world, but it's supposed to look like a world, a consistent world. A consistent style. And I find that this method works best for me. So the hair is mostly done, still sitting on its own layer, so it's easy for me to work with it again later. But now I'm going to start working on the dress. Same kind of pattern. I'll use the gradient tool to put down the first blast of light. This can actually give it a bit of a translucent feel, almost a glowing feel to the figure. I'll do less of that when I'm working with metal, because you really want those to be hard contrasts. So I don't necessarily want to brush too much of the lighter color into areas that are supposed to be darker. But you can do that with organic things, with dress fabric, with hair, especially with blonde hair. So it has almost an inner glow. It's picking up not only the light being cast on it from the direction you're starting with, but it will also pick up light through the hair. The same with skin tones. Your skin is actually translucent. You're actually seeing, when you're looking at skin, you're actually looking through the surface of the skin. So it can have, if done properly, a bit of an inner glow. And that's just because light bouncing around the environment and coming through the other side of the limb will also be seen through it very slightly. So primary painting for the right-hand side completed. Now getting into the green lighting coming from the left-hand side frame. All being consistent, making sure that the lighting matches the lighting on the dress, matches the lighting on the hair. It won't go quite as bright because the texture is different. It'll be absorbing light differently. So all three of the main elements on the character, the skin tone, the dress, and the hair, will all reflect light differently. So the hair will go very, 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 very bright because it's initially a blonde hair. The skin tone will be bright, but generally not quite as bright. And then the dress will be a bit dimmer, a little bit duller. But there'll be a few spots where I'll go a bit brighter. So now we got the basic pass done on the dress and on the metal wristbands. And moving on to doing the skin tones. Again, brushing in that, using the gradient tool to cast that purple light over almost the entire figure, so that even in the areas that are going to go green, there's a little bit of that purple light, just to give it a sense of translucency, a little bit of a sense of it almost glowing. Now switching over to a paintbrush. These paintbrushes, by the way, these are just the basic Photoshop round paintbrushes. When I'm doing an ink illustrations, I'll generally want the brush to be even softer to contrast with the hard lines of inks. So I'll switch to a very soft edge, much more of an airbrush style brush. But when I'm doing pencil work, conversely, it tends to have a bit more of a hard edge when I'm painting, because the softness is built into the pencil lines, into the pencil texture that I've done already. So you can get away with harder edge painting. Just doing a quick pass with this purple midtone over the whole figure, keeping in mind her right arm. So the arm on the left side of the figure is actually, it's not getting very much of the purple light at all. It's almost completely in shadow from the rest of the figure. So it'll have a lot of the green light coming from the left-hand side of frame, whereas her left arm, the one here on the right side of frame, is getting much more of the purple light. So that's another good way to make sure your figure feels three-dimensional. Not only is the light being cast onto the character, indicating the direction of light, but because her torso is blocking the light from the arm on the left side of the frame, it's leaving that in shadow. That'll be mostly just green lighting. I'll be putting a little bit of the purple light right here as a side light, because it still is being bounced around the environment, but the vast majority of the light falling on the light on the arm on the left-hand side of frame will be coming from the left-hand side. So that green light that I'll be playing with, that's currently on the dress and on her hair. And now we're getting into playing with that same green light. So brushing it in, starting on the legs. Again, like when I was painting initially, painting from back to front, Then painting the hair, then the dress. The last element that I paint is typically the skin tones. I'll also tend to start the furthest away from the face. I like leaving the face for last. That's where the most interest is. And it's always the part that I enjoy painting the most. So I tend to leave that as, this is the thing to look forward to. This is the part you'll have the most fun with. And now painting in a lot of the green light, using the grad tool to gradient a lot of that green light into her arm. The gradient tool, for those using Photoshop, is set to normal, usually using a circular gradient tool. There's also a starburst one that I used a few times here. It creates an effect similar to the circular tool, but just with an extra spike in there. It's kind of a nice effect in this particular image. But yeah, for the most part, if I'm using the gradient tool, it's using it with a circular pattern, and then going in and hand painting the green light even on this particular arm, because she will still, even though the bulk of her body would be blocking most of that green light, some of it's still bouncing around the environment. That arm is still behind her slightly, because that railing is technically behind her. So when her hand is touching it, it would be behind her back. So it would easily pick up some of the green light coming from the left side of frame. And now adding in a little bit of a highlight to the green. Again, painting from dark to light. Now adding in more of a glowing effect on her eyes. So there's even a little bit more interest. And then finally getting to the books that are floating in front of her. Normally I wouldn't be painting this last. Normally it would be the figure being painted last, but because it's so far forward in the frame, I thought it might be nice to have, do the books last, because they will be influenced by not only the lighting in the environment, but lighting bouncing off of her into the foreground, into these books floating in space. So that'll change my how I approach painting them, dealing with light. Even though like these pages are facing to the left, so they will be getting green light on them, they're also facing her. She's been mostly being hit by this purple light, and that purple light will get then reflected back into the pages of the books. So a lot of the pages of the books actually are doused in purple light. But you can also see there is some green light on the left side of each of those books. Now dealing with the leather binding on each one of these floating books. Not doing a lot of painting on this. I want to have more contrast. Leather would have a higher contrast than the paper. The paper would go to white a lot faster. The leather bindings would be a lot darker, so I'll put in very little of the mid-tone color, and then very little of the green mid-tone coming from the left side of frame. Again, creating a sense of three-dimensionality, working heavily with the light and dark pattern I already created in the pencils. There really isn't a lot of painting being done here. A lot of the color work, most of these decisions were all finished. They were all made while doing the pencil portion. So now we're getting into casting this green light over the background. I first put it on a layer that's directly over the furthest background layer and realized, well, nope, that'll actually affect those books and certain other elements in the background. So very easily just drag that special effects layer up a few layers. So it's affecting more things. And now I'm changing that special effects layer to screen. All the layers that have been on here before this, aside from the line art layer, which is set to multiply, we're just on normal. It would be like painting on Mylar or something. But painting on screen makes the colors you put down interact with the elements behind it a lot differently. It actually starts stripping away other colors behind it and creates a much more of a light effect, as though you're actually shining a light. Now you need to play a lot with this one. It can be tricky to master. These are the kind of things I've been using Photoshop professionally since 1997, which is why I'm still using it, even though I'm wanting to experiment more with a few other painting programs. But I've gotten very comfortable with using things like multiply and screen in both the layers and in the various tools. But those can take the most work to get used to. I can talk about them more, but honestly, there are probably a lot of other resources that on YouTube that could discuss exactly what screen does. Now that I've got some green light cast in the background, some lighter purple cast onto that background, I want to create more of a light effect from the mouths of these pumpkins, of these jack-o'-lanterns everywhere. So over top of the coloring, those color layers, I'm adding a bit of a special effect over top. Now this isn't affecting the line art. I will be doing another special effects layer later that will be affecting it. And actually, that's the effect I put over the eyes right now. So now I'm adding an additional special effects layer, this time over the entire image, including the line art. I brushed that purple from the right-hand side of frame over the entire image, so it'll start tweaking the line art as well as the background colors, softening it a bit, giving it a bit more of a washed lighting effect, kind of similar to things you would see in a Ridley Scott movie. There's a lot of influences from Ridley Scott and Tony Scott in a lot of my artwork with regard to lighting effects. With the bulk of those special effects done, now I can see where there needs to be a little bit more contrast in the face and a few other things. So I'll add another layer on top of my regular layers. This will still be behind the line art though, and go in and put in some additional highlights on the skin tone to bring it out just a little bit more. Separate that texture a little bit more from the dress, from her hair. I don't want to overdo this, because if it ends up being nothing but flashy highlights, then it kind of diminishes the impact of the overall drawing. You're looking to make a strong indication of where the light is coming from, of creating a sense of three-dimensionality to the whole figure. But if you put flashy highlights over the entire figure, it can kind of also flatten it out and lose the impact of those kind of specific lights. So I still want very deep areas of shadow, and these extra little highlights used periodically will actually, by default, deepen the shadows behind them. Now adding a bit onto the arm as well. Most of the detail went into the face, into the collarbone, but specifically the face to really bring that out and add more to her expression. And oh yeah, into the knuckles and into the hand as well. Again, wanting to, to give it a bit more of a three-dimensional feel, because you're not just showing the hand, but you want to show the bone structure underneath the hand. You want to show the musculature underneath the hand and in the arm. If you make it completely, just a completely straight line, it'll make her arm look very cylindrical. But there's actually muscle and bone beneath that, so you want to indicate that. And a few extra highlights here and there can go a long way to playing with that. Now, if this had been, let's go back to the idea, if this had been an ink illustration, for the most part, her skin tones would not have had any additional shading on them, and I would be doing a lot of that with color. But here, it was mostly just a few extra highlights and playing with tone. Now, I'm adding some additional highlights, additional glowing effects to the pumpkins, and this is going over the line art. So it'll be affecting everything. Just to give it more of a sense that those are actually lights. They're not just... The interior of the pumpkins, the interior of the jack-o'-lantern is not just painted green, but it is actually a light source spilling out over everything else. It's not dominating the painting. It's not dominating the illustration. It's just a little bit of extra color in the background, a little bit of extra detail, but just adds to the overall effect. And I believe that's pretty much everything. I'll make sure to save periodically. And there we go. The finished Halloween Sorceress Pencils to Color piece. Thank you very much for hanging out. Hope to see you in the next video.